The Healing Heart of Meadowbrook. The autumn morning arrived softly over the small town of Meadowbrook, carrying with it the gentle promise of golden light and the quiet hush that comes when the world is still waking. The trees along Maple Street had begun their slow transformation, their leaves turning to shades of amber and rust, drifting down like whispered secrets onto the sidewalks below. In this peaceful corner of the world, where neighbors still waved to one another and the local bakery filled the air with the scent of fresh bread each morning, life moved at a gentle, unhurried pace. Dr. Eleanor Bennett stood at the window of her modest apartment, a warm cup of chamomile tea cradled between her palms. She watched as the early light painted the rooftops in soft shades of pink and gold, feeling the familiar sense of gratitude that greeted her each morning. At 42, Eleanor had spent nearly 2 decades caring for the people of this community, first as a young resident at Meadowbrook General Hospital, and now as one of its most trusted physicians. Her dark hair, now threaded with silver at the temples, framed a face that carried both the weariness and the warmth of someone who had dedicated her life to healing others. Her apartment was small, but filled with the quiet comforts that made it feel like home. A well-worn armchair sat beside the window, its cushions softened by years of use. Shelves lined the walls, holding books on medicine and poetry alike, their spines creased from countless readings. A knitted blanket, made by her grandmother many years ago, lay draped over the back of the couch, its soft wool the color of heather in springtime. These were the things that anchored Eleanor, that reminded her of who she was beneath the white coat and the stethoscope. She took a slow sip of her tea, feeling its warmth spread through her chest like a gentle embrace. Outside, a cardinal had settled on the branch of the old oak tree, its red feathers bright against the muted browns and golds of autumn. Eleanor smiled softly, remembering how her mother had always said that cardinals were messengers of love, appearing when someone in heaven was thinking of you. It had been 5 years since her mother had passed, and still these small moments of connection brought Eleanor a quiet sense of peace. The apartment was filled with the gentle sounds of morning, the soft tick of the clock, the distant murmur of traffic on the street below, the occasional creak of the old building settling into itself. Eleanor had lived here for nearly 15 years, ever since she had taken the position at Meadowbrook General, and in that time, the space had absorbed her presence, becoming an extension of who she was. Every corner held a memory, every object told a story, and together they created a sanctuary where she could retreat from the demands of her profession and simply be herself. She thought of the day ahead, of the patients she would see, the cases she would review, the quiet moments of connection that made her work feel meaningful. There was Mrs. Henderson, who was recovering from hip surgery and always asked about Eleanor's garden. There was young Tommy Winters, whose asthma had been acting up with the change of seasons. There was Mr. Castellano, the retired firefighter who came in every few weeks for blood pressure checks and always brought her homemade biscotti from his wife's kitchen. These were the relationships that sustained Eleanor, the human connections that reminded her why she had chosen this path. The kitchen window looked out over a small courtyard where a magnolia tree grew, its branches bare now but promising the soft pink blooms of spring. Eleanor had watched that tree through every season, had seen it bud and blossom and drop its petals like snow, had found comfort in its constancy through all the changes that life had brought. It was a reminder that time moved forward, that seasons changed, that even the darkest winters gave way eventually to warmth and renewal. She rinsed her cup and set it in the dish rack, her movements unhurried, almost meditative. There was a rhythm to her mornings that she had cultivated over years of practice, a gentle sequence of small rituals that prepared her for the day ahead. The tea, the quiet contemplation at the window, the slow gathering of her things. Each step was a kind of prayer, a way of centering herself before stepping out into the world. Her thoughts drifted to her father again, as they often did in these quiet moments. Dr. Robert Bennett had been a family physician in a rural community 3 hours north of Meadowbrook, a place where everyone knew everyone, and the doctor was as much a part of the social fabric as the preacher or the school teacher. He had made house calls until the day he retired, driving his old pickup truck down dirt roads to reach patients who could not make it to his office. He had delivered babies and held the hands of the dying, had been present for the full spectrum of human experience, and he had done it all with a humility and grace that Eleanor had spent her entire career trying to emulate. She remembered sitting in his office as a child, watching him with patience, absorbing the way he listened, really listened, to their concerns. He never rushed, never made anyone feel like they were taking up too much of his time. He had a gift for making people feel seen, for recognizing the person beneath the symptoms, for treating the whole human being rather than just the illness. It was a gift that Eleanor had inherited, though she sometimes felt she was still learning how to use it fully. The morning light had shifted now, growing brighter, more insistent, and Eleanor knew it was time to begin her transition from the private self to the professional one. She moved through the apartment with the quiet efficiency of long practice, gathering her bag, her keys, her hospital ID. At the door, she paused to check her reflection in the mirror, smoothing a stray hair, straightening the collar of her blouse. The face that looked back at her was familiar, but somehow strange, marked by time and experience, carrying the weight of all the lives she had touched. She thought of all the patients she had lost over the years, the ones she could not save despite her best efforts. Each one had left a mark on her heart, a small scar that never quite healed. She carried them with her, these lost ones, honoring their memory by continuing to show up, to try, to care. It was a burden, yes, but it was also a privilege, a reminder of the sacred trust that existed between healer and patient. The door closed behind her with a soft click, and Eleanor stepped out into the crisp autumn morning, ready to face whatever the day would bring. The clock on the mantel chimed softly, its gentle tones reminding her that the morning was moving forward, that soon she would need to make her way to the hospital. But for now, in this hushed and golden hour, she allowed herself to simply breathe, to feel the stillness settling around her like a soft blanket. The radiator hummed quietly in the corner, filling the room with warmth, and somewhere in the distance she could hear the faint sound of church bells beginning their morning song. Eleanor had always loved mornings like this, when the world seemed to hold its breath and everything felt possible. She thought of the patients she would see today, the lives she would touch, the small acts of kindness that made up the fabric of her days. Medicine, she had learned long ago, was not just about treating illness. It was about seeing people, truly seeing them, in their vulnerability and their strength, their fear and their hope. It was about sitting with someone in their darkest hour and reminding them that they were not alone. She finished her tea and set the cup gently in the sink, running her fingers along the smooth ceramic. The kitchen was bathed in soft morning light, the white curtains glowing like clouds touched by sunrise. A small vase of dried lavender sat on the windowsill, its fragrance faint but comforting, a reminder of summer days spent in her grandmother's garden. Eleanor took a deep breath, drawing the scent into her lungs, feeling it calm the quiet flutter of anticipation that always preceded her shifts at the hospital. As she gathered her things and prepared to leave, she paused at the door, looking back at the apartment that had been her sanctuary for so many years. It was modest, yes, but it was hers, filled with the memories and the moments that had shaped her into the person she had become. She thought of her father, who had been a country doctor in a town much like this one, making house calls with his worn leather bag, sitting at kitchen tables and listening to the stories of his patients. He had taught her that medicine was a calling, a sacred trust, and that the true measure of a healer was not in the accolades they received, but in the compassion they showed to those who needed it most. With a quiet sigh, Eleanor opened the door and stepped out into the crisp autumn air. The leaves crunched softly beneath her feet as she walked down the path to the sidewalk, the morning breeze carrying the earthy scent of fallen leaves and distant wood smoke. Meadowbrook was beginning to stir, shop owners opening their doors, neighbors heading out for their morning walks, children waiting at the corner for the school bus. Eleanor waved to Mrs. Patterson, who was sweeping the steps of her front porch, and received a warm smile in return. The walk to Meadowbrook General Hospital took about 15 minutes, a route Eleanor had traveled so many times that she could have walked it with her eyes closed. She passed the old library with its stone columns and arched windows, the small park where children played on sunny afternoons, the corner cafe where she sometimes stopped for a cup of coffee and a moment of quiet reflection. Each landmark was familiar, each turn a reminder of the years she had spent in this community, caring for its people, becoming a part of its story. Meadowbrook General was a modest hospital, 3 stories of red brick and white trim, nestled at the edge of town where the residential streets gave way to open fields and distant hills. It was not a grand institution, not the kind of place that attracted specialists from around the world or made headlines in medical journals, but it was the heart of the community, the place where babies were born and the elderly were comforted, where broken bones were mended and worried hearts were soothed. Eleanor had always felt a deep sense of pride in being part of this place, in contributing to the quiet, essential work that happened within its walls. As she approached the hospital entrance, she noticed a figure sitting on the bench near the emergency room doors. He was an older man, his clothes worn and faded, his gray beard unkempt, his shoulders hunched against the morning chill. A battered backpack sat at his feet, and he held a paper cup in his trembling hands, though it appeared to be empty. Eleanor's heart stirred with compassion as she took in the scene, recognizing the quiet dignity that so often accompanied those who had fallen on hard times. She slowed her pace, studying the man more closely. His face was weathered, lined with the stories of a life lived through hardship, but his eyes, when they briefly met hers, held a gentleness that surprised her. There was no aggression in his gaze, no demand or expectation, only a quiet weariness that spoke of long nights spent in doorways and the slow erosion of hope that came from being overlooked day after day. Eleanor felt something stir within her, a recognition of the shared humanity that bound them together despite their different circumstances. She thought of her father again, of the way he had always treated every patient with the same respect and attention, regardless of their station in life. He had taught her that illness did not discriminate, that suffering touched the wealthy and the poor alike, and that a true healer opened their heart to all who needed care. It was a lesson that had guided Eleanor throughout her career, shaping her into the kind of doctor who saw beyond the surface, who understood that every person carried within them a story worthy of being heard. The hospital doors slid open, and Eleanor stepped inside, the familiar smell of antiseptic and floor polish greeting her like an old friend. The lobby was quiet at this early hour, the reception desk staffed by a young woman named Jenny, who looked up and smiled as Eleanor passed. The halls were bathed in soft fluorescent light, the walls painted in soothing shades of sage and cream, artwork from local artists hanging at regular intervals. It was a space designed to comfort, to reassure, to remind patients and visitors alike that they were in capable, caring hands. The hospital had its own rhythms, its own heartbeat, and Eleanor had learned to read them over the years. She could tell by the energy in the corridors whether it was going to be a calm day or a hectic one, could sense the mood of the staff from the tempo of their footsteps and the tone of their greetings. Today felt quiet, settled, the kind of day that allowed for thoughtful medicine rather than frantic triage. She was grateful for that. She passed the nurses' station on the second floor, exchanging warm greetings with the team on duty. There was Sarah, the head nurse who had been at Meadowbrook for nearly as long as Eleanor, her calm competence a reassuring presence in any crisis. There was David, the young nurse who had recently transferred from the city and was still adjusting to the slower pace of small-town medicine. There was Maria, whose gentle way with anxious patients had made her a favorite among the long-term residents. These were the people who made the hospital work, Eleanor knew, the unsung heroes who showed up day after day to care for the sick and the suffering. Doctors might get the credit, might have their names on the doors and their faces in the newsletters, but it was the nurses and aides and technicians who provided the steady, constant presence that patients needed most. Eleanor had always made a point of acknowledging their contributions, of treating them as partners rather than subordinates, of recognizing that healing was a collaborative effort. The staff lounge was a small room at the end of the hallway, furnished with worn but comfortable chairs, a refrigerator covered with photographs of staff members' families, a coffee maker that someone had decorated with stickers from various medical conferences. It was not a glamorous space, but it was a welcoming one, a place where the staff could catch their breath between the demands of their shifts, share a moment of laughter or a word of support. Eleanor made her way to the staff lounge, where she hung her coat and exchanged her comfortable walking shoes for the sensible flats she wore during her shifts. A few of her colleagues were already there, sipping coffee and chatting quietly about their weekends, their families, the small joys and challenges that made up their lives outside these walls. Eleanor joined them briefly, sharing a warm greeting and a few moments of connection before the demands of the day began to unfold. The conversation drifted easily, touching on the new restaurant that had opened downtown, the high school football team's unexpected winning streak, the way the autumn colors this year seemed more vibrant than usual. It was the kind of talk that knit a community together, the shared observations and small concerns that reminded everyone they were part of something larger than themselves. Eleanor listened more than she spoke, content to absorb the warmth of the interaction without feeling the need to contribute to every topic. There was comfort in being among people who knew her, who accepted her, who did not expect her to be anything other than what she was. In a profession that often demanded performance, demanded confidence, demanded answers, these moments of simple humanity were precious. But even as she smiled and nodded, her thoughts kept returning to the man on the bench outside. She wondered about his story, about the path that had led him to this place, about the dreams he might once have held and the circumstances that had brought him to sit alone in the cold morning air. There was something about him that tugged at her heart, a quiet call that she could not ignore, even as she tried to focus on the tasks that awaited her. The morning shift began gently, as most mornings did at Meadowbrook General. Eleanor checked on the patients who had been admitted overnight, reviewing charts and conferring with nurses, offering words of comfort to those who were anxious or afraid. She listened to heartbeats and checked blood pressure, asked about pain levels and sleep quality, made notes and adjustments with the careful attention that had become second nature to her over the years. Each patient was a person, a life, a story, and Eleanor treated them all with the same quiet dedication. By mid-morning, the pace had picked up slightly, as it always did. A young mother brought in her toddler, worried about a persistent cough. An elderly gentleman arrived with chest pains that turned out to be nothing more than indigestion, though Eleanor took the time to reassure him thoroughly before sending him home. A teenager with a sprained ankle from soccer practice sat patiently while Eleanor examined the swelling and recommended rest and ice. These were the moments that made up the tapestry of her days, small acts of care and attention woven together into something meaningful. It was just after 11 when the commotion near the emergency entrance caught Eleanor's attention. She was finishing up her notes on a patient when she heard raised voices, a tone of urgency and distress that cut through the usual calm of the hospital. She set down her pen and made her way toward the sound, her footsteps quickening as she rounded the corner and saw what was happening. The man from the bench was now inside the hospital, supported by 2 security guards who seemed uncertain what to do with him. His face was pale, his breathing labored, and even from a distance, Eleanor could see that something was seriously wrong. A nurse stood nearby, her expression torn between concern and hesitation, while the hospital administrator, Mr. Gerald Whitmore, approached with a look of displeasure that Eleanor knew all too well. Gerald Whitmore was a man who had spent his career climbing the administrative ladder, more concerned with budgets and protocols than with the human beings who passed through these halls. He was not unkind, exactly, but he had a way of seeing patients as numbers on a spreadsheet, costs to be managed rather than lives to be cared for. Eleanor had clashed with him before, gently but firmly, advocating for patients who might otherwise have been overlooked or turned away. It was a tension that simmered beneath the surface of their professional relationship, rarely acknowledged but always present. Now, as she watched Gerald approach the homeless man with that familiar look of calculation in his eyes, Eleanor felt her heart tighten with a protective instinct that she could not suppress. She moved forward, her pace steady, her expression calm but determined. Whatever was about to happen, she would not stand by and watch a man in need be turned away from the doors of a place dedicated to healing. The security guards had helped the man into a chair near the entrance, where he sat slumped forward, his chest heaving with the effort of each breath. Up close, Eleanor could see the grayish tinge to his skin, the way his hands trembled even as they gripped the armrests, the faint blue cast to his lips that spoke of oxygen deprivation. This was not a man who simply needed a warm place to rest. This was a man who needed medical attention, and he needed it now. She knelt beside him, her voice soft and reassuring as she introduced herself. His name, she learned, was Walter Hensley. He spoke in halting sentences, each word an effort, but Eleanor listened patiently, her hand resting gently on his arm in a gesture of comfort and connection. She learned that he had been feeling unwell for several days, that the tightness in his chest had grown worse overnight, that he had finally made his way to the hospital because he was afraid he might not wake up if he fell asleep again. Eleanor's heart ached at the quiet courage in his words, at the dignity he maintained even in his distress. She thought of all the patients she had seen over the years, the ones who had waited too long to seek help because they were afraid of being a burden, because they did not believe they deserved care. Walter was one of them, a man who had lived in the shadows of society, invisible to so many, yet deserving of the same compassion and attention as anyone else who walked through these doors. She was about to call for a wheelchair to bring Walter to an examination room when Gerald Whitmore's voice cut through the moment like a cold wind. "Dr. Bennett, a word, please." Eleanor looked up, meeting his gaze with a calm that belied the tension building in her chest. She rose slowly, giving Walter's hand a gentle squeeze before stepping aside to speak with the administrator. The conversation that followed was quiet but pointed, conducted in low tones so as not to be overheard, though the substance of it weighed heavily on Eleanor's heart. Gerald explained in his measured, bureaucratic way that the hospital had policies regarding uninsured patients, that resources were limited, that there were protocols to be followed. He suggested that Walter might be better served at the county facility across town, that Meadowbrook General was not equipped to handle cases like his, that there were liability concerns and financial considerations that could not be ignored. His words were not cruel exactly, but they were cold, devoid of the compassion that Eleanor believed should be at the heart of every decision made within these walls. Eleanor listened quietly, her expression composed, her hands folded in front of her. She understood the pressures that Gerald faced, the constraints that came with running a hospital in a time of shrinking budgets and increasing demands. She knew that he was not a villain, merely a man doing his job as he understood it, trying to balance the books and keep the institution afloat. But she also knew, with a certainty that ran deeper than any policy or protocol, that there were some things that mattered more than the bottom line. When Gerald finished speaking, Eleanor took a slow breath and met his eyes with a gentleness that surprised even herself. "Gerald," she said softly, "I understand your concerns. I truly do. But that man over there is in distress. He needs help, and he needs it now. I took an oath to care for the sick, to do no harm, and I cannot in good conscience turn him away. Please let me examine him. Let me see what we are dealing with, and then we can talk about next steps." For a long moment, Gerald said nothing, his expression unreadable. Eleanor could see the conflict playing out behind his eyes, the tension between the administrator he had become and the better angels of his nature. She waited, patient and still, trusting that somewhere within him compassion would prevail. Finally, Gerald sighed, a sound that carried the weight of compromise and resignation. He nodded slowly, his shoulders sagging slightly as he stepped aside. "Fine," he said quietly. "Examine him. But I want a full report, and I want it by the end of the day. And if this turns into something bigger, Dr. Bennett, it is going to be on your head." Eleanor nodded, accepting the terms without argument. She knew that she had won a small victory, a moment of grace in a system that often seemed designed to exclude those who needed it most, but she also knew that the battle was far from over, that the road ahead would be difficult, and that the choice she was making might carry consequences she could not yet foresee. She returned to Walter's side, her heart steady, her purpose clear. Whatever came next, she would face it with the same quiet courage that had guided her throughout her career. For now, there was a man who needed her help, and that was all that mattered. Eleanor gently helped Walter into a wheelchair, her movements calm and unhurried, designed to put him at ease even as she felt the urgency of his condition pressing against her professional composure. The hallway stretched before them, bathed in the soft glow of overhead lights, the walls lined with framed photographs of Meadowbrook through the decades. She pushed the wheelchair slowly, allowing Walter to catch his breath, speaking to him in quiet, reassuring tones about the examination room they were heading to, about the tests she would run, about the care he would receive. Walter listened in silence, his weathered hands resting in his lap, his eyes fixed on some distant point that only he could see. There was a stillness about him that Eleanor found both heartbreaking and beautiful, a kind of acceptance that came from years of navigating a world that had not always been kind. She wondered again about his story, about the life he had lived before circumstance had brought him to this place, about the person he had been and the dreams he had once held close to his heart. The examination room was small but comfortable, painted in soft shades of blue and cream, the afternoon light filtering through the window to cast gentle patterns on the floor. Eleanor helped Walter onto the examination table, adjusting the pillow behind his head and draping a warm blanket over his legs. She took his vital signs with practiced ease, noting the elevated heart rate, the low blood pressure, the labored quality of his breathing. The picture that was forming in her mind was concerning, though she kept her expression calm and her voice gentle. The room was equipped with the standard tools of her trade, a blood pressure cuff mounted on the wall, a stethoscope draped over a hook, a small desk with a computer for entering notes. But Eleanor had always believed that the most important tools a doctor possessed could not be purchased from a medical supply company. Listening, observing, connecting, these were the skills that made the difference between treatment and true healing. She moved around the examination table with a quiet efficiency born of years of practice, her hands gentle as she checked Walter's pulse, examined his chest, listened to the sounds of his breathing through her stethoscope. Each piece of information she gathered added to the picture she was building, the diagnostic puzzle that would eventually guide her treatment decisions. As she worked, Eleanor asked Walter about his history, his symptoms, the timeline of his illness. He answered as best he could, his voice thin and tired, his sentences often trailing off into silence. He told her that he had been a carpenter once, that he had built houses and furniture, that he had taken pride in his work and in providing for his family. He spoke of a wife who had passed away many years ago, of children who had grown up and moved on, of a series of misfortunes that had slowly stripped away everything he had built. There was no self-pity in his voice as he spoke, no bitterness or blame. He recounted the events of his life with the detachment of someone who had made peace with his circumstances, who had stopped fighting against the current and learned instead to simply float. It was a kind of acceptance that Eleanor had seen before in patients who had been through great hardship, a surrender that was not giving up, but rather a recognition that some things were beyond control. He spoke of the recession that had taken his construction business, the medical bills that had accumulated after his wife's illness, the downward spiral that had eventually landed him on the streets. He spoke of shelters that were full and waiting lists that were long, of nights spent in doorways and under bridges, of the slow erosion of dignity that came from being invisible to the world around him. Eleanor listened without judgment, her heart opening to the quiet tragedy of his story. She understood, as she always had, that homelessness was rarely a choice, that it was often the end result of a cascade of losses, each one building upon the last until there was nothing left to hold on to. She saw in Walter not a failure or a burden, but a human being who had fallen through the cracks of a society that did not always catch those who stumbled, and she resolved in that moment to do everything in her power to help him find his way back to solid ground. She asked about his family, about whether there was anyone she could contact on his behalf. Walter's face grew distant at the question, a shadow passing over his features like a cloud across the sun. He spoke of his daughter, Claire, with a mixture of love and regret that was almost painful to witness. There had been a falling out, he said, years ago, something said in anger that had never been taken back. He had tried to reach her after Margaret died, but his letters had come back unopened, and eventually he had stopped trying. Eleanor made a mental note to explore this further, sensing that beneath Walter's acceptance lay a deep well of grief and longing. The loss of family, she knew, was often the most devastating loss of all, the one that left the deepest scars and the most persistent ache. If there was any chance of reconnecting Walter with his daughter, any possibility of healing that wound, she wanted to help make it happen. The tests she ordered were thorough but not excessive, designed to give her the information she needed without subjecting Walter to unnecessary discomfort. Blood work, an electrocardiogram, a chest x-ray. She explained each procedure before it happened, making sure he understood what was being done and why, treating him with the same respect and consideration she would have shown any patient. Walter accepted it all with quiet gratitude, his eyes meeting hers from time to time with an expression that spoke of trust slowly being rebuilt. While they waited for the results, Eleanor sat with Walter in the examination room, the two of them sharing a comfortable silence that felt like a kind of companionship. She asked him about his life before, about the things he missed, about the small pleasures that still brought him joy. He told her about the sunrise, how he would sometimes find a quiet spot on the edge of town to watch the sky turn from gray to pink to gold. He told her about the library, where he would go on cold days to sit in the warmth and read books about history and nature and the great explorers of the past. He told her about the kindness of strangers, the occasional hot meal or warm coat that reminded him that he had not been entirely forgotten. Eleanor felt her eyes grow moist as she listened, touched by the resilience and the grace that Walter had managed to preserve despite everything he had endured. She thought of all the people who passed him by each day without seeing him, all the eyes that looked through him as if he were invisible, all the assumptions and judgments that kept him at arm's length from the community that surrounded him. It was a loneliness she could only imagine, a kind of exile that must have been almost unbearable at times. And yet here he was, still finding beauty in the sunrise, still seeking knowledge in the pages of books, still holding on to his humanity with both hands. The results, when they came, confirmed what Eleanor had suspected. Walter was suffering from pneumonia, complicated by an underlying heart condition that had gone untreated for years. His lungs were filled with fluid, his heart struggling to keep up with the demands of his body, his immune system weakened by malnutrition and exposure. It was serious, more serious than Eleanor had hoped, but it was not hopeless. With proper treatment and care, Walter had a fighting chance. Eleanor shared the news with Walter gently, framing it in terms of hope rather than fear. She explained the treatment plan she had in mind, the medications she would prescribe, the rest and nutrition he would need to recover. She told him that she wanted to admit him to the hospital to keep him under observation for a few days until his condition stabilized. Walter listened quietly, his expression difficult to read, his hands folded in his lap like a man who had learned long ago not to expect too much from the world. But there was something else in his eyes, something that looked almost like hope. And Eleanor held on to that as she prepared to do battle with the forces that would try to deny him the care he so desperately needed. The afternoon sun had begun its slow descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the hospital corridors. When Eleanor found herself summoned to Gerald Whitmore's office, she walked the familiar path with a sense of calm determination, her footsteps steady on the polished linoleum, her mind focused on the conversation that lay ahead. She knew what was coming, had known it from the moment she decided to admit Walter over Gerald's objections. But she also knew that she had made the right choice, the only choice that her conscience would allow, and that knowledge gave her strength. Gerald's office was located on the 3rd floor, a corner room with windows that looked out over the parking lot and the fields beyond. The furniture was functional rather than elegant, the walls decorated with certificates and commendations that spoke to a career built on efficiency and order. Gerald himself sat behind his desk, his expression a careful mask of professional concern, though Eleanor could see the tension in the set of his jaw and the stiffness of his posture. "Please, sit down, Dr. Bennett," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. His voice was measured, the tone of a man who had spent years learning to deliver difficult news without betraying emotion. Eleanor sat, her hands resting lightly on the armrests, her gaze meeting Gerald's without flinching. She waited for him to speak, giving him the space to say what he needed to say, trusting that whatever came next, she would face it with the same quiet courage that had brought her this far. Gerald began by acknowledging her skills as a physician, her dedication to her patients, the respect she had earned among her colleagues. His words were complimentary, almost warm, but Eleanor sensed the shift that was coming, the turn in the conversation that would reveal the true purpose of this meeting. She listened patiently, accepting the praise without allowing it to soften her resolve. Then Gerald's tone changed, becoming more serious, more pointed. He spoke of budgets and regulations, of the hospital's financial obligations, of the difficult decisions that had to be made in order to keep the institution viable. He explained that admitting Walter, an uninsured patient with a complex and costly condition, set a precedent that the hospital could not afford to follow. He spoke of liability, of the board of directors, of the pressures that came from forces beyond his control. Eleanor listened to it all, her expression unchanged, her heart steady. She understood the constraints Gerald was describing, the impossible mathematics of healthcare in a world where resources were limited and needs were endless. But she also understood something that Gerald seemed to have forgotten, something fundamental and essential that lay at the very heart of their profession. When he finished speaking, Eleanor took a slow breath and began to respond. Her voice was calm, gentle even, but there was a firmness beneath the surface that could not be ignored. "Gerald," she said, "I hear what you are saying. I understand the pressures you are under, but I became a doctor to help people, to heal the sick, to care for those who have no one else to turn to. Walter Hensley is a human being. He is not a line item on a budget or a risk to be managed. He is a man who is suffering, who came to us for help, and who deserves the same care and compassion we would give to anyone else who walked through those doors." She paused, allowing her words to settle in the space between them. Gerald's expression flickered, a momentary crack in the professional facade, but he said nothing. "I know there will be consequences for my decision," Eleanor continued. "I accept that, but I will not apologize for doing what I believe is right. I cannot look at myself in the mirror and know that I turned away a dying man because he could not pay. That is not the kind of doctor I want to be. That is not the kind of person I want to be." The silence that followed was heavy, thick with the weight of unspoken thoughts and conflicting loyalties. Gerald stared at Eleanor for a long moment, his face unreadable, his fingers drumming slowly on the surface of his desk. Finally, he sighed, a sound that seemed to carry all the weariness of his position, all the compromises and calculations that had brought him to this point. "I am going to have to take this to the board," he said quietly. "You understand that, don't you? This is out of my hands." Eleanor nodded, accepting the news with a grace that surprised even herself. She had known, on some level, that this moment would come, that her decision to put compassion above policy would eventually bring her into conflict with the powers that governed the hospital. But she had made her peace with that possibility long ago, had understood from the beginning that there were some battles worth fighting, even if the outcome was uncertain. She rose from her chair, her movements calm and deliberate, and extended her hand to Gerald. "Thank you for hearing me out," she said simply. "Whatever happens next, I want you to know that I hold no ill will toward you. We are both trying to do our jobs as best we can. I just hope that, in the end, we can find a way to remember why we got into this work in the first place." Gerald took her hand, his grip firm but brief, his eyes betraying a complexity of emotion that his words did not reveal. Eleanor left his office with her head held high, her heart filled with a quiet certainty that carried her through the rest of the afternoon and into the soft embrace of evening. The days that followed were a kind of suspended time, a holding pattern in which Eleanor continued her work while waiting for the storm she knew was coming. She cared for Walter with the same dedication she showed all her patients, monitoring his progress, adjusting his medications, sitting with him during the long hours when loneliness threatened to overwhelm him. She watched as his color improved, as his breathing became easier, as the spark of life began to return to his tired eyes. Walter, for his part, accepted Eleanor's care with a gratitude that was both humbling and heartbreaking. He was not accustomed to being treated with kindness, to being seen as a person rather than a problem to be solved or ignored. Each small act of compassion, each gentle word, each moment of genuine connection seemed to fill something within him that had been empty for far too long. He began to speak more freely, to share memories and stories that he had kept locked away, to allow himself to hope that perhaps his life was not yet over. Eleanor learned that Walter had served in the military many years ago, that he had been stationed overseas during a conflict that still haunted his dreams. She learned that his wife, Margaret, had been the love of his life, a schoolteacher with a laugh like music and a heart full of kindness. She learned that the loss of Margaret, followed by a series of health problems and financial setbacks, had sent him spiraling into a darkness from which he had struggled to emerge. Each piece of his story added depth to the picture she was forming, the portrait of a man who had once had everything and had lost it all, yet somehow managed to retain his essential humanity. Meanwhile, the hospital buzzed with whispered conversations and sidelong glances, the staff aware that something significant was unfolding, even if they did not know all the details. Eleanor felt the weight of their curiosity, the mixture of support and skepticism that colored their interactions with her. Some colleagues offered quiet words of encouragement, slipping notes of solidarity under her office door or catching her eye with looks of understanding. Others kept their distance, unwilling to be associated with a decision that might have consequences they could not predict. Eleanor accepted it all with equanimity. Drawing strength from her conviction that she had done the right thing, she continued to show up for her shifts, to care for her patients, to be the kind of doctor she had always aspired to be. She refused to let fear or uncertainty change who she was, trusting that whatever happened, she would find a way to move forward. The meeting with the board of directors was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon, exactly 1 week after Walter had first arrived at the hospital. Eleanor received the notification with a calm that surprised her, though beneath the surface her heart beat a little faster, her thoughts racing through the possible outcomes. She knew that her job was on the line, that the board had the power to end her career at Meadowbrook General with a single vote, but she also knew that she would not change her decision, would not trade her integrity for the security of a position, no matter how much she had come to love this place and the people who filled it. The night before the meeting, Eleanor sat alone in her apartment, the lamp casting a warm glow over the room, the silence broken only by the ticking of the clock on the mantel. She thought about her father, about the lessons he had taught her, about the kind of doctor he had been. She thought about Walter, about the progress he was making, about the hope that was slowly returning to his eyes. She thought about all the patients she had cared for over the years, the lives she had touched, the moments of connection that had made her work feel meaningful. And she thought about the choice that lay before her, the crossroads at which she now stood. She could go into that meeting and defend her decision, standing firm in her conviction that compassion must come before policy. Or she could soften her stance, offer compromises and apologies, try to smooth things over in the hope of preserving her position. The second option would be easier, certainly. It would allow her to continue her work, to keep helping people, to avoid the disruption and uncertainty that would come with losing her job. But as Eleanor sat in the quiet of her apartment, watching the shadows dance on the walls, she knew that she could not take the easier path. She had spent her entire career trying to be the kind of person who did the right thing, even when it was hard, even when there was a cost. She could not abandon that commitment now, not when it mattered most, not when a man's dignity and a principle she held sacred were at stake. She went to bed that night with a peace that surprised her, the peace of someone who had made their decision and accepted whatever would come. The morning would bring what it would bring. For now, she would rest. The boardroom was located on the top floor of the hospital, a space designed to impress with its long mahogany table, leather chairs, and windows that offered a panoramic view of Meadowbrook and the surrounding countryside. Eleanor had been in this room only a handful of times before, usually for routine presentations or staff recognitions. Today, the atmosphere was different, charged with a tension that seemed to thicken the air and make the silence between words feel heavy and significant. The board members were already seated when Eleanor arrived, their faces arranged in expressions of practiced neutrality. Gerald Whitmore sat at one end of the table, his role as administrator placing him at the center of the proceedings. At the other end sat Margaret Chen, the board chairwoman, a silver-haired woman with sharp eyes and a reputation for fairness that Eleanor found reassuring. The other members filled the seats between them, a collection of business leaders, retired physicians, and community representatives who together held the power to shape the future of Meadowbrook General. Eleanor took her seat at the table, her hands folded calmly in front of her, her gaze steady as she looked around the room. She had prepared what she wanted to say, had rehearsed the words in her mind until they felt natural and true. But she also knew that the outcome of this meeting did not rest entirely in her hands, that there were forces at play that she could not control. All she could do was speak her truth and trust that it would be heard. Gerald opened the meeting with a summary of the situation, his tone careful and measured, presenting the facts without obvious bias. He described Walter's arrival at the hospital, Eleanor's decision to admit him over administrative objections, the costs that had been incurred, the precedent that had been set. He acknowledged Eleanor's dedication to her patients, her exemplary record, the respect she had earned among her colleagues. But he also emphasized the financial realities of running a hospital, the difficult choices that had to be made, the responsibilities that came with stewardship of a community institution. When Gerald finished, Margaret Chen turned to Eleanor and invited her to speak. The room fell silent, all eyes on the doctor who had chosen compassion over convenience, principle over protocol. Eleanor took a slow breath and began. She spoke first of her father, painting a portrait of the country doctor who had shaped her understanding of what medicine could be. She described the small town where he had practiced, the way he knew every family by name, the house calls he made in all weather and at all hours. She told them about the worn leather bag he carried, the stethoscope that had belonged to his own father, the quiet dignity with which he approached every patient, regardless of their ability to pay. She wanted them to understand where she came from, the tradition of compassion that had been passed down to her like a sacred inheritance. She spoke of Walter next, not as a case or a problem, but as a human being with a story as rich and complex as any of theirs. She described his years as a carpenter, the pride he had taken in building homes for families, the furniture he had crafted with his own hands. She told them about Margaret, his wife, the school teacher with a laugh like music who had been the center of his world. She spoke of the cascade of losses that had brought him to their doors, the medical bills, the recession, the slow erosion of everything he had worked for. Her voice was gentle but clear, and she could see some of the board members leaning forward, drawn into the narrative despite themselves. She spoke of the oath she had taken, reciting the words from memory, her voice steady and clear. She reminded them that the Hippocratic tradition was not just about treating disease, but about serving humanity, about recognizing the inherent dignity of every person who sought healing. She spoke of the covenant between physician and patient, the sacred, trust that had existed since the dawn of medicine, the promise that those who suffered would not be turned away. She acknowledged the challenges the hospital faced, the financial pressures that Gerald had described, the difficult decisions that came with running an institution in an era of shrinking resources and expanding needs. She did not pretend that these concerns were unimportant or that the board's responsibilities could be dismissed. She understood, she said, that leadership meant balancing competing goods, that sometimes there were no perfect answers, only the best choices available in difficult circumstances. But she also asked them to consider what kind of hospital they wanted Meadowbrook to be. Was it simply a business, she asked, a place where care was rationed based on ability to pay? Or was it something more, a sanctuary for the suffering, a beacon of hope in a community that needed places of compassion? She reminded them that the reputation they built would outlast any quarterly report, that the legacy they left would be measured not in profit margins but in lives touched and suffering relieved. She concluded by speaking about the nature of healing itself, about the mysterious alchemy that occurred when one human being truly saw another in their vulnerability and chose to help. It was not just about medications and procedures, she said. It was about presence, about connection, about the recognition that we are all bound together in our shared humanity. When we turn away from suffering because it is inconvenient, she said, we diminish not only the person we have rejected, but ourselves as well. Her words were not angry or defensive. They were gentle, thoughtful, filled with the quiet conviction that had guided her throughout her career. When she finished speaking, she folded her hands in her lap and waited, trusting that she had said what needed to be said, that the rest was beyond her control. The room remained silent for a long moment. Eleanor could feel the weight of the decision hanging in the air, the balance of competing interests and values that the board would have to weigh. She had said what she needed to say. Now it was out of her hands. Margaret Chen was the first to speak, her voice calm and measured, her questions probing but fair. She asked Eleanor about the specifics of Walter's case, about the medical decisions she had made, about the outcomes she expected. Other board members followed with their own questions, some sympathetic, others more skeptical, all seeking to understand the full picture before casting their votes. The discussion that followed was long and sometimes difficult, the board members wrestling with the tension between compassion and practicality, between the ideal and the possible. Eleanor listened as they debated, her heart heavy but her resolve unshaken. She had done what she believed was right. Whatever came next, she would accept it with grace. Finally, after what felt like hours, Margaret Chen called for a vote. The board members cast their ballots in silence, their faces betraying nothing of their thoughts. Gerald collected the votes and passed them to Margaret, who reviewed them with an expression that gave nothing away. Then she looked up, her eyes meeting Eleanor's across the length of the table. "Dr. Bennett," she said, her voice carrying a weight that seemed to fill the room, "the board has reached a decision." Eleanor felt her heart skip a beat, her breath catching in her throat. She steadied herself, drawing on the reserves of calm that had sustained her through so many difficult moments. Whatever the verdict, she would face it with dignity. Margaret paused, as if gathering her thoughts, and then continued. "This has been a difficult situation, and there are no easy answers. We have a responsibility to the financial health of this institution, but we also have a responsibility to the community we serve, to the values that define who we are as a hospital. After careful consideration, the board has decided—" She paused again, and Eleanor felt the seconds stretch into eternity. "The board has decided that your actions, while unconventional, reflect the best traditions of medicine and the values we aspire to uphold. We will not be terminating your employment. However, we do expect you to work with administration to develop protocols for handling similar situations in the future, so that compassion and fiscal responsibility can be balanced more effectively." Eleanor felt a wave of relief wash over her, so powerful that she had to grip the edge of the table to steady herself. She had been prepared for the worst, had steeled herself for the possibility that her career at Meadowbrook General might be over. To hear that she would be allowed to continue, that her decision had been validated rather than condemned, was more than she had dared to hope. She thanked the board with sincere gratitude, her voice steady despite the emotions swirling within her. She promised to work with Gerald and the administrative team to find solutions that honored both the hospital's mission and its financial realities. She left the boardroom with her head held high, her heart full of a quiet joy that seemed to light her from within. The weeks that followed were a time of healing, not just for Walter, but for the entire hospital community. Eleanor worked closely with Gerald and a committee of colleagues to develop new guidelines for treating uninsured patients, creating a framework that balanced compassion with practicality. The process was not always easy, the discussions sometimes contentious, but there was a sense of shared purpose that made the work feel meaningful. Walter, meanwhile, continued to improve under Eleanor's care. His pneumonia resolved, his heart condition stabilized, and slowly, day by day, his strength returned. He began to take short walks through the hospital corridors, nodding to the nurses and staff who had come to know him, his weathered face breaking into occasional smiles that transformed him entirely. There was a dignity in his bearing now, a sense of being seen and valued that had been missing for far too long. Eleanor visited him often, not just to check on his medical progress, but to sit and talk, to continue the conversations that had begun in those first difficult days. She learned more about his life, about the family he had lost touch with, about the dreams he still harbored despite everything he had been through. And Walter, in turn, learned about Eleanor, about her father and his influence on her career, about the small joys and quiet sorrows that made up her life. A bond formed between them, the kind of connection that transcends the usual boundaries between doctor and patient. It was a friendship built on mutual respect and shared humanity, on the recognition that every person carries within them a story worthy of being heard. Eleanor found herself looking forward to their conversations, to the moments of warmth and understanding that punctuated her busy days. One afternoon, as autumn deepened toward winter and the first frost began to silver the grass outside Walter's window, a visitor arrived at the hospital asking to see him. Eleanor was on duty when the call came through, and she made her way to the reception area with a curiosity she could not quite explain. The visitor was a woman in her early 50s, her dark hair streaked with gray, her eyes carrying a mix of hope and hesitation that Eleanor recognized immediately. She was dressed simply but neatly, her hands clasped in front of her in a gesture that spoke of nervous anticipation. When she saw Eleanor approaching, her expression shifted, becoming more open, more vulnerable, as if she had been waiting for permission to let down her guard. She introduced herself as Claire, Walter's daughter, the one he had spoken of with such longing and regret during their many conversations. Her voice trembled slightly as she spoke, and Eleanor could see the effort it took for her to maintain her composure. Eleanor's heart swelled as she listened to Claire explain how she had found her father. A social worker at the hospital, moved by Walter's story, had helped her track him down, reaching out through old records and patient advocacy networks. The process had taken weeks, Claire explained. Each lead followed carefully, each dead end accepted with patience. She had never given up, never stopped believing that one day she would find him again. Claire spoke of the years of separation, of the anger that had driven them apart, of the regret that had slowly replaced it as time passed. She told Eleanor about the letter she had finally written, pouring out everything she had been too proud or too hurt to say before. She had sent it to the last address she had for her father, not knowing if it would ever reach him, hoping against hope that somehow, someday, they would find their way back to each other. And then she had received a call from the hospital, from a social worker named Rebecca, who had been helping to coordinate Walter's care. Rebecca had mentioned that Walter spoke often of his daughter, that he carried a photograph of her in his wallet, that he had asked in his quiet way if there might be any way to reach her. Claire had wept when she heard that, had dropped everything and driven through the night to be here, to see with her own eyes that her father was alive, that he had not forgotten her, that forgiveness was still possible. Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes as she listened to Claire's story, moved by the courage it took to reach across years of silence and pain, to choose reconciliation over resentment. She thought of all the families she had seen torn apart by misunderstanding and pride, all the relationships that had withered for lack of the simple words that might have healed them. Here was a chance for something different, a chance for two people who loved each other to find their way home. She led Claire to Walter's room, her footsteps light with the joy of witnessing something beautiful unfold. She knocked gently on the door and stepped aside, giving father and daughter the space they needed for their reunion. What happened next was something Eleanor would remember for the rest of her life. The look on Walter's face when he saw his daughter, the way his eyes filled with tears that spilled down his weathered cheeks, the trembling of his hands as he reached out to embrace her. Claire crossed the room in 3 swift strides and folded herself into her father's arms, her own tears falling freely, her voice choked with emotion as she whispered words of love and forgiveness. They held each other for a long time, these two who had been separated by years and misunderstanding, clinging to each other as if afraid that letting go might break the spell. Eleanor watched from the doorway, her heart full to overflowing, a witness to the healing power of connection and the resilience of the human spirit. She thought of all the patients she had cared for over the years, all the lives she had touched, and she understood that this moment, this reunion, was the reason she had become a doctor. Not for the accolades or the recognition, but for moments like this, when the barriers between people fell away and love was allowed to do its work. She slipped quietly from the room, leaving father and daughter to their reconciliation, and made her way down the corridor with a lightness in her step that she had not felt in weeks. The autumn sun was streaming through the windows, casting long golden rays across the floor, and somewhere in the distance she could hear the sound of laughter drifting from one of the patient rooms. Meadowbrook General had never felt more like home. The days grew shorter and the nights grew longer as winter settled over Meadowbrook with a gentle hush. Snow began to fall in soft, silent flurries, blanketing the town in white, transforming familiar landscapes into scenes from a storybook. The hospital took on a cozy quality during these months, the warmth of its interior a welcome contrast to the cold outside, the holiday decorations lending a festive air to the corridors and common areas. Walter was discharged just before Christmas, his health restored, his spirit renewed by the reconnection with his daughter. Claire had found him a small apartment in a senior living community not far from her own home, a place where he would have support and companionship, where he could begin the slow process of rebuilding his life. Eleanor helped with the arrangements, connecting Walter with social services and community resources, making sure he had everything he needed for a fresh start. The day Walter left the hospital was bittersweet, marked by tearful goodbyes and promises to stay in touch. He embraced Eleanor with a strength that surprised her, his voice thick with emotion as he thanked her for everything she had done. "You gave me back my life, Dr. Bennett," he said, his eyes shining with gratitude. "You saw me when no one else did. I will never forget that. Never." Eleanor felt her own eyes grow moist as she returned his embrace, her heart full of the quiet joy that came from knowing she had made a difference. She told Walter that the honor was hers, that caring for him had been a privilege, that she hoped their paths would cross again in happier circumstances. She pressed a small card into his hand with her contact information, urging him to reach out if he ever needed anything at all. As she watched Walter and Claire walk out through the hospital doors and into the bright winter sunshine, Eleanor felt a sense of completion settle over her like a warm blanket. The journey that had begun on that autumn morning, when she had first noticed a lonely man sitting on a bench outside the emergency room, had come full circle. There had been challenges along the way, moments of doubt and conflict, but in the end, compassion had prevailed. Love had prevailed. And that was all that really mattered. The holidays passed in a blur of celebration and reflection, the hospital quieter than usual as patients were discharged to spend time with their families. Eleanor spent Christmas Eve at home, curled up in her favorite armchair with a cup of hot cocoa and a well-worn copy of her favorite book. The snow was falling softly outside her window, the streetlights casting a gentle glow that made the world look peaceful and still. She thought about the year that was ending, about all the patients she had cared for, the lives she had touched, the lessons she had learned. She thought about Walter and Claire, about the miracle of their reunion, about the way that even the darkest circumstances could give way to hope and healing. She thought about her colleagues at Meadowbrook General, the nurses and doctors and staff who showed up every day to do the hard, often thankless work of caring for others. She felt a deep gratitude for all of them, for the community she was part of, for the calling that had shaped her life. And she thought about the future, about the patients who would come through the hospital doors in the year ahead, each one carrying their own story, their own needs, their own hopes and fears. She did not know what challenges awaited her, what difficult decisions she would have to make, what moments of joy or sorrow lay in store. But she knew that she would face them all with the same quiet courage that had brought her this far, the same commitment to compassion that had defined her career. The clock on the mantel chimed midnight, marking the transition from one year to the next. Eleanor raised her cup of cocoa in a silent toast to the unknown future, to the patients she had yet to meet, to the healing that was yet to come. Then she set down her cup, pulled the blanket closer around her shoulders, and allowed herself to drift into a peaceful sleep, lulled by the soft rhythm of her own breathing and the gentle whisper of snow against the window. Spring arrived early that year. the snow melting into streams that wound their way through the awakening landscape, the trees budding with the promise of new life. Eleanor felt the change of season as a kind of rebirth, a lifting of the heaviness that winter always brought, a renewal of energy and hope. She threw herself into her work with fresh enthusiasm, grateful for each day, each patient, each opportunity to make a difference. One morning, as she was making her rounds, she received a message that there was a visitor waiting for her in the lobby. Curious, she made her way downstairs, her mind running through the possibilities. When she rounded the corner and saw who was waiting for her face broke into a wide smile. Walter stood in the lobby, looking healthier than she had ever seen him. He was dressed in a neat sweater and pressed trousers, his gray beard trimmed, his eyes bright with life. Beside him stood Claire, beaming with pride, and a young boy who Eleanor guessed must be Walter's grandson. "Dr. Bennett," Walter called out, crossing the lobby to meet her. "I hope you don't mind us dropping by. We were in the neighborhood, and I wanted you to meet someone." He turned and gestured to the boy, who stepped forward shyly, his hand in Claire's. "This is my grandson, Michael. Michael, this is the doctor I told you about, the one who helped Grandpa get better." Michael looked up at Eleanor with wide, curious eyes. "Thank you for making my grandpa better," he said solemnly. "He tells me stories now. Good stories." Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes as she knelt down to be at Michael's level. "It was my pleasure, Michael. Your grandpa is a very special man. I'm glad I got to help him." She stood and turned to Walter, her heart full of the kind of joy that comes from witnessing the ripple effects of a single act of kindness. Walter's life had been transformed, yes, but so had Claire's and Michael's. And who knew how many others who would be touched by the stories Walter now had the chance to tell. "How are you feeling?" she asked, her professional instincts taking over, even in this moment of personal connection. "Better than I have in years," Walter replied, his voice strong and clear. "The doctors at the clinic say my heart is doing well, Claire makes sure I eat right and take my medications, and Michael here keeps me young." He ruffled the boy's hair affectionately. They talked for a while longer, catching up on the month since Walter's discharge, sharing stories and laughter that drew curious glances from the hospital staff passing by. When it was time for them to go, Walter embraced Eleanor one more time, his grip firm, his voice warm. "You saved my life, Dr. Bennett. But more than that, you gave me back my family. I don't have the words to thank you properly, but I wanted you to know that every good day I have, every moment with Claire and Michael, I think of you. You reminded me that there are still good people in this world, people who care. I needed to know that, more than you can imagine." Eleanor watched them go, the 3 generations walking out into the bright spring sunshine, their figures growing smaller as they crossed the parking lot. She stood in the lobby for a long moment after they had disappeared from view, her heart full, her mind at peace. Then she turned and walked back toward the elevator, ready to continue her rounds, ready to meet whatever the day would bring. There were patients waiting, lives to be touched, moments of connection to be made. This was her calling, her purpose, her reason for being, and she would not have it any other way. The summer that followed was one of the most fulfilling of Eleanor's career. The new protocols she had helped develop for treating uninsured patients were implemented across the hospital, creating a more compassionate and equitable system that balanced financial realities with the fundamental mission of healing. Other hospitals in the region began reaching out, interested in learning from Meadowbrook's example, and Eleanor found herself invited to speak at conferences and symposiums about the intersection of compassion and healthcare policy. She approached these opportunities with characteristic humility, always redirecting praise to the team that had worked alongside her, to the board members who had made the brave decision to support her, to the countless patients whose stories had shaped her understanding of what it meant to be a healer. She spoke of Walter often, his story serving as a powerful illustration of what was possible when healthcare institutions chose to see people rather than problems. Through it all, Eleanor remained grounded in her daily work at Meadowbrook General. She continued to care for patients with the same dedication and warmth that had always defined her practice, treating each person as an individual deserving of respect and attention. She mentored younger doctors, sharing the wisdom she had accumulated over 2 decades of practice, encouraging them to hold on to their idealism even in the face of a system that sometimes seemed designed to wear it down. The recognition that came her way was gratifying, but it was not what drove her. What drove her was the same thing that had always driven her: the simple, profound desire to ease suffering, to offer comfort, to remind people that they were not alone in their struggles. Every patient she treated, every hand she held, every word of reassurance she offered was a continuation of the work her father had begun, a living legacy of compassion passed down through generations. One evening in late summer, as the sun was setting in a blaze of orange and pink, Eleanor received a letter in the mail. The envelope was plain, the handwriting unfamiliar, but something about it drew her attention. She opened it carefully and began to read. The letter was from a woman she had never met, a stranger who had heard Eleanor's story through a friend of a friend. The woman wrote of her own experiences with the healthcare system, of feeling overlooked and dismissed, of losing hope that anyone cared about her as a person rather than a diagnosis. She wrote of how hearing about Eleanor's stand for Walter had restored her faith, had reminded her that there were still doctors who saw their patients as human beings deserving of dignity and respect. "You probably don't remember me," the woman wrote, "because we have never met. But I wanted you to know that your story mattered to someone. It mattered to me. Thank you for being the kind of doctor you are. Thank you for reminding all of us what medicine can be when it is practiced with heart." Eleanor read the letter twice, then a third time, her eyes filling with tears that she did not try to stop. She thought of all the unseen ripples that spread out from every act of kindness, the ways that compassion multiplied and echoed through lives she would never know. She thought of Walter, of Claire, of Michael, of the board members who had chosen to support her, of the colleagues who had stood by her side, and she understood, in a way that was both humbling and uplifting, that she was part of something much larger than herself. She was one thread in a vast tapestry of care and connection, one voice in a chorus of healers reaching back through history and forward into the future. Her father's legacy lived on through her, and one day, she hoped, it would live on through others she had inspired. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in a small wooden box on her dresser, alongside other treasures she had collected over the years: a photograph of her father, a card from a grateful patient, a pressed flower from her mother's garden. These were the things that reminded her why she did what she did, the anchors that kept her, grounded when the work became difficult, the stars she navigated by when the path grew dark. Outside her window, the last light of day was fading into the soft blue of twilight. The first stars were beginning to appear, pinpricks of light in the vast expanse of the sky. Eleanor stood at the window for a long moment, watching the darkness deepen, feeling the peaceful rhythm of her own breathing. Tomorrow would bring new patients, new challenges, new opportunities to make a difference. But tonight, in this quiet moment of reflection, she allowed herself to simply be present, to feel the gratitude that filled her heart, to rest in the knowledge that she had done her best, that she had stayed true to her values, that she had lived a life of meaning and purpose. The night settled around her like a gentle embrace, and Eleanor felt the tension of the day begin to release, her body relaxing, her mind growing still. She thought of Walter, wondered if he was watching the same stars, if he was feeling the same sense of peace. She hoped so. She hoped that wherever he was, he knew that he was loved, that he mattered, that his story had touched lives he would never know. She turned from the window and made her way to her bedroom, the familiar path lit by the soft glow of the nightlight in the hallway. Her bed was waiting for her, the covers turned down, the pillows plump and inviting. She slipped beneath the sheets and felt the cool softness of the cotton against her skin, the weight of the blanket settling over her like a protective cocoon. Her thoughts drifted as sleep began to claim her, carrying her toward dreams of quiet rooms and gentle conversations, of patients healed and families reunited, of a world where compassion was the rule rather than the exception. She saw her father's face, smiling at her with the pride she had always hoped to see, and she felt a warmth spread through her chest that was like coming home. The night wrapped around her, soft and dark and peaceful, and Eleanor let herself surrender to it, trusting that when morning came she would be ready to face whatever it brought. For now, there was only this moment, this breath, this heartbeat. For now, there was only rest. The years that followed brought changes, as years always do. Eleanor continued her work at Meadowbrook General, watching as younger doctors joined the staff, as some colleagues retired and others moved on, as the hospital evolved and adapted to meet new challenges. She remained a constant presence, a steady hand guiding the institution through times of uncertainty, a voice for compassion in a world that sometimes seemed to have forgotten its value. Walter remained in her life, a dear friend whose visits brought joy to her days and whose story continued to inspire all who heard it. He had settled comfortably into his new apartment, surrounded by photographs of his family and the simple comforts that made a house a home. Claire visited often, bringing Michael and, eventually, a new baby sister named Eleanor, in honor of the doctor who had given them back their father, their grandfather, their family. The news of the baby's name had moved Eleanor more than she could express, a recognition that felt both undeserved and profoundly meaningful. She visited Walter on the day the baby was born, holding the tiny bundle in her arms and marveling at the miracle of new life, at the way that hope could spring from the most unlikely circumstances. Walter watched her with tears in his eyes, his face radiant with a joy that seemed to light him from within. "She's beautiful," Eleanor whispered, stroking the baby's soft cheek. "Just beautiful." "She's got your heart," Walter replied. "Claire says so. A heart that sees people, that cares, that doesn't give up. That's what you gave us, Dr. Bennett. That's what you gave all of us." Eleanor stayed for dinner that night, sharing a meal with Walter and his family, feeling the warmth of their love wrap around her like a favorite sweater. They talked and laughed and told stories, the conversation flowing easily, the bonds between them strengthened by all they had been through together. When it was time for Eleanor to go, she left with a full heart and a lightness of spirit that stayed with her for days. This was what it meant to be a healer, she thought as she drove home through the quiet streets of Meadowbrook. Not just treating illness, not just prescribing medications, but being present with people in their moments of need, seeing them for who they truly were, offering the gift of compassion without conditions or expectations. It was a calling that demanded everything and gave back more than she had ever imagined possible. The seasons continued their endless cycle, spring giving way to summer, autumn to winter, each year bringing its own joys and sorrows, its own challenges and triumphs. Eleanor celebrated birthdays and holidays, mourned colleagues who passed away, welcomed new doctors who looked to her for guidance and wisdom. She continued to learn and grow, to be humbled by how much she did not know, to be inspired by the resilience and courage of the patients she served. And through it all, she held on to the lessons that had shaped her, the values that had guided her, the love that had sustained her. She thought often of her father, of the way he had approached his work with such quiet dedication, such genuine care. She hoped that she had made him proud, that somewhere, somehow, he could see the doctor she had become, the life she had built, the difference she had made. One evening, many years after the events that had first brought Walter into her life, Eleanor found herself sitting alone in her apartment, the autumn leaves drifting past her window in the fading light. She was older now, her hair more silver than dark, her face lined with the stories of all the lives she had touched, but her eyes were still bright, still warm, still filled with the compassion that had defined her entire career. On her lap was a thick album filled with photographs and letters and mementos from the years she had spent at Meadowbrook General. She turned the pages slowly, pausing at each image, each memory, allowing herself to feel the emotions that rose within her. There was Walter's thank you letter, written in his careful hand. There was a photograph of baby Eleanor, now a bright-eyed girl with a smile that could light up a room. There was a pressed flower from a patient's garden, a card signed by the entire nursing staff, a newspaper clipping about the new protocols she had helped develop. Each item was a thread in the tapestry of her life, a reminder of the people she had known and the moments they had shared. She felt a deep gratitude for all of it, for the privilege of having been allowed to serve, to heal, to love. It had not always been easy. There had been moments of doubt, times when the weight of responsibility had felt almost too heavy to bear. But she would not have traded any of it, not for all the ease and comfort in the world. The clock on the mantel chimed softly, marking the hour, and Eleanor looked up from her album with a gentle smile. Outside, the first stars were beginning to appear, the same stars she had watched so many times before, the same stars that would continue to shine long after she was gone. There was comfort in that continuity, in the knowledge that the work she had begun would be carried forward by others, that the legacy of compassion she had tried to build would live on. She closed the album and set it aside, then rose from her chair and walked to the window. The evening was cool, but not cold, the air carrying the scent of fallen leaves and distant wood smoke. She watched as the lights of Meadowbrook began to twinkle on, one by one, each one a small beacon of warmth in the gathering darkness. Somewhere out there, Walter was settling in for the night, surrounded by his family, his heart at peace. Somewhere, a young doctor was making rounds at the hospital, perhaps feeling the same nervous excitement that Eleanor had felt all those years ago. Somewhere, a patient was receiving the news that would change their life, and a compassionate voice was there to guide them through. The work went on, the healing continued, the love endured. Eleanor felt a profound sense of peace settle over her, a knowing that all was as it should be. She had done her best. She had stayed true to her values. She had made a difference in the lives of those she had touched. That was enough. That was more than enough. She drew the curtains and made her way to her bedroom, the familiar path lit by the soft glow of the lamp on her nightstand. Her bed was waiting for her, comfortable and welcoming, a haven at the end of another day. She slipped beneath the covers and felt the weight of tiredness settle into her bones, a pleasant heaviness that promised deep and restful sleep. Her thoughts drifted as she closed her eyes, carrying her toward dreams of quiet rooms and gentle conversations, of patients healed and families reunited, of a world made brighter by small acts of kindness. She saw Walter's face, smiling at her with gratitude and love. She saw her father, nodding with approval, his eyes full of pride. She saw all the patients she had cared for over the years, their faces blending together into a single expression of thanks. And then, gradually, the images faded, and there was only peace, only stillness, only the soft rhythm of her own breathing, steady and calm, guiding her down into the welcoming darkness of sleep. The night wrapped around her like a soft blanket, gentle and warm, holding her close as she drifted deeper and deeper into rest. The world outside continued on its way, the stars wheeling slowly across the sky, the seasons preparing to change once more. But here, in this quiet room, there was only peace, only healing, only love. And so the story comes to its gentle close, like a lullaby sung at the edge of sleep, like the last light of day fading into the soft embrace of night. Eleanor's journey was one of courage and compassion, of standing firm in the face of adversity, of choosing love over fear and kindness over convenience. It was a journey that touched many lives and left the world a little brighter, a little warmer, a little more hopeful than it had been before. In the quiet town of Meadowbrook, where the trees still turn golden in autumn and the bakery still fills the air with the scent of fresh bread each morning, her legacy lives on. It lives in the protocols she helped create, in the doctors she inspired, in the patients who carry her kindness in their hearts. It lives in Walter and Claire and little Eleanor, in the stories they tell and the love they share, in the way they look at strangers with compassion instead of judgment. And it lives in you, dear listener, as you drift toward sleep on this quiet night. It lives in the reminder that every act of kindness matters, that every person deserves to be seen, that compassion is not a weakness but a strength. It lives in the knowledge that even when the world seems dark and cold, there are those who choose to be lights, who refuse to turn away from suffering, who believe that healing is possible even in the most hopeless circumstances. So let yourself rest now. Let the tensions of the day melt away like snow in spring. Let your body sink deeper into the comfort of your bed. Know that you are held, that you are safe, that the universe is unfolding as it should. Know that tomorrow will bring new opportunities for kindness, new chances to make a difference, new moments of connection and compassion. But that is tomorrow. Tonight there is only rest, only peace, only the gentle rhythm of your own breathing, carrying you deeper into sleep with each exhale. Only the soft darkness wrapping around you like a cocoon, protecting you, nurturing you, preparing you for the new day. That will come. The story is complete, but the healing continues. The night is deep, but the morning will come. And when it does, you will rise refreshed, renewed, ready to carry your own light into the world. For now, just rest, just breathe, just be. The stars are watching over you. The night is holding you close, and somewhere, in a quiet corner of the universe, love is whispering your name. Sleep well, dear one. Sleep well.